I never aspired to be a mob guy. But, I grew up with my father, who was a very high profile guy in the 60s. Once I got in, I said, hey, I'm going to be the best possible mob guy I could be. Here's how it's going to go. 75% me, 25% you. He comes to my house and he's got a box on his shoulder. It's a Saturday morning. He comes in and I said, what are we doing with all this meat? Are we having a party or something I don't know about? He said, hey, Chief, it ain't meat. Puts the box down. He opens it up. He said, this is the first 2 weeks taking the gas business. It was $320,000. I had over 350 gas stations, and we were servicing just about every branded and unbranded station that we can get a hold of. And we grew that 320 into 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 million a week. I got that call one night. I was concerned. I thought I could have walked into that room and not walked out again. The setup was not good. It was bad. I had about 15 agents surrounding me. And one guy looked at me, I'll never forget. He was an FBI agent, and he said, Michael, not this time. You became a star, and they were lining up to testify against you. Life is tough enough when you're doing the right thing and everything is good. When you get involved in criminal activity and you put more baggage on your shoulders to carry around, life gets so difficult. You got to play it straight at life, and that's the best possible shot that you have at having a decent life.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Michael Franzese, the former American Mafia boss turned motivational speaker and author. As a captain of the feared Colombo crime family, you at one point were earning $10 million a week, making you the second highest earning mobster of all time behind Al Capone. In 1986, at age 35, Forbes listed you as one of the 50 most wealthy and powerful mafia bosses. Today, 48 of those are dead, one is serving life in prison, making you the only free man left. For your crimes, you served 6 years in federal prison, with 3 of those in solitary confinement. Today, you tour the world telling your story of the mafia as a warning to others of the dangers of living a life of crime. Michael, welcome to London Real.
Good to be here. Thank you.
It's great to have you here, Michael. I guess I wanted to start off and just tell you my brief story of my experience with, mafia and the mob. And it's kind of telling because it's got to do with the poster behind you. I grew up in San Diego, California, and in the 80s, I had never heard of the mob. I'd never heard of mafia because we just didn't have that history out there at that time. And it wasn't until I went to school in Boston and I woke up one morning at the fraternity house and I was all alone and I stuck in a copy of The Godfather, and that's the first time I was ever opened up to this life, and it just blew my mind, and I was just like, wow, I didn't know this existed. And 2 years later, I moved to New York City. This was 1993, and I was a trader on Wall Street. And one night, the guys took me out to Sparks Steakhouse, right? And I was just a junior, and they wanted to show me how large they lived, and the brokers took us out, the bookies took us out. And I still remember they brought out these wine glasses that were as big as my head and these steaks that were massive. And I was just this kid, in probably a bad suit and a bad tie. And at one point during the meal, they said, you know what happened out in front here? And I said, no, I don't know what happened. And they said, well, there was a murder out in front. And I was like, really? And they said, yeah, that's where we think John Gotti had Paul Castellano gunned down. And it was kind of my first introduction that there was this life. And Giuliani was in power then, and he was really trying to crack down on the city. But I kind of missed maybe the era that you were there, but I got the tail end of it. And I'm wondering, what does that remind you of when you think of those times? And the mid-'80s was kind of the time of transition wasn't it? Where kind of the old style was moving away and it was kind of not like it was going to be anymore. Is that what's kind of happening in the mid 80s?
Oh yeah, and growing up in San Diego, we didn't really have a presence out here at all. So maybe a little bit in LA, but certainly not down south. But yeah, 80s was certainly a transitional time. Brian, I always look at the golden era, the golden years of the mob, really from the 50s to the mid 80s. That's when everything was happening. We had control of, certainly New York City, many cities across the country had tremendous influence in the unions and even into the White House. But in the 80s, things started to change. They started to really use the racketeering laws effectively. Rudy Giuliani, you got to give him the credit or the blame, whatever side you're on, for really using that effectively and certainly made a big transition. The mid 80s was really the major transition of the mob in the United States.
Yeah, and you starred in this recent, series called Fear City on Netflix, which I recommend everyone watching. And it really got me back up to speed as what was happening kind of in the 80s in New York City with the concrete rackets and also this new technology that was this RICO statute and how the prosecutors kind of got educated on how to use it, and it completely changed the game. And I know, you've been quoted as saying when the guys on the street started fearing the government more than they were fearing our life, that's when everyone started flipping, and it was never the same again, was it?
No, it wasn't. And that was the big tool, the big weapon, the racketeering law, the Bail Reform Act. You didn't get bail if you were a danger to the community or a flight risk. And the Sentencing Reform Act, which gave huge sentences for crimes that before you didn't get that much time for. So what happened, they were locking a lot of people up and saying, hey, you're either going to cooperate with us or we're going to put you in jail under the RICO statute for the rest of your life. And, a lot of guys don't stand up under that, Brian. And that's when, informants really started to come forward. And of course, the use of technology, we just didn't keep up with their surveillance techniques. I mean, Brian, they had so much on tape, really the whole life was exposed through these secret tape recordings. I mean, in the John Gotti case, they had 2,000 hours of recordings. And I listened into some of them because we had the same attorney. They were listening to these tapes in the lawyer's room. And boy, they were devastating.
Wow. What I found fascinating about Fear City is that before that, they couldn't really touch you because, again, I call it technology, but due to the organization of the family structures, they could never really stick anything of note on anyone. And it always had that way of protecting the bosses. And they were very frustrated. Like you said, I guess from the 50s kind of to the mid 80s, they really couldn't do much about the five families. And it wasn't until the RICO statute and, like you said, married with the tech, and then those big sentences that everything started changing.
Yeah, it was very difficult. And remember this, a lot of guys went down for murder, for homicide. And prior to the RICO statute, murder was a state charge. It wasn't a federal charge unless you murdered a federal agent or you were on federal land. But under the RICO statute, murder became one of the predicate acts. So they were able to indict and convict people on murder in a federal system where they were never able to do that before. That was huge for them. So, I personally, I don't like the RICO law. I think it's unconstitutional, but of course I would have come to that. I was indicted twice under federal RICO statute and once under the state. So, I've had my share of RICO.
You want to hear something funny about RICO? So I was an interest rate derivatives trader for Bankers Trust, and it was on One Liberty Plaza, which was right next to the World Trade Center. And again, I'm 22 years old. I'm on the 33rd floor. I'm on a trading floor, and they're allowing me to trade, futures and bonds. And like for me, it was like the time of my life. But funny enough, that our bank was later prosecuted, and they threw the RICO Act at the bank because they had put a couple of different corporations into these fancy derivative trades. And the CFOs of those corporations, when the trades kind of tanked, put up their hands and saying, I got talked into this trade. And it happened with like Procter & Gamble and a couple other companies. And they said there was a system of them doing it to repeated corporate customers. And so they threw RICO at it, which tripled the damages. So in a weird way, Michael, they used that thing against even the banks.
Well, yeah, that's what happens whenever they create a law like this. I know the law was created by a fellow by Edward DeBakey, I think his name was, and it was created in 1970 specifically to go after the mob. And but you give the government a tool, and they kind of open it up, and they'll use it whenever they feel they can be effective with it. And so they started using the RICO law against any company that they said was a criminal enterprise. They created or made it a criminal enterprise, and then it would fall under the RICO statute.
There's a narrative in Fear City where you've got the Giulianis of the world and the lawmakers of the world saying, here are these mob guys. They're shaking down mom and pop businesses, these immigrants. They're really doing a lot of pain to the community. And then the other side is, I think, you guys, the wise guys that are saying, you know what, we actually make this place run better. We're better for business. We provide somewhat protection. We keep out the small-time criminals. Who's right?
Well, look, initially when, mob guys came here from Italy, I mean, they were preying on their own people in the neighborhoods. I mean, that's how this thing kind of started. They were extorting them, looking for protection money. It doesn't happen like that, on a widespread basis anymore. I mean, honestly, I never did that. If I went partners with somebody and they paid me, I gave them a service. It wasn't that we were just, leaning on them and extorting them. But it does happen to a degree with some of the smaller time guys. But, on a major level, I don't see it that way. Now, some people are going to disagree with me. But look, I had 25 years of my experience in that life. Others may have experienced it a little bit differently. But, I didn't see that as widespread as the government says we did it.
Okay. And what do you think of Giuliani when you see him on that, the same show you starred in? And you guys were playing a game. And I don't know if you ever watched the show The Wire. But it's kind of interesting because you got kind of the cops and the drug dealers, and they're almost playing a type of a game, of a cat and mouse game against each other. Like, what do you think of him and everything that happened in retrospect?
Well, listen, again, you got to give him the credit, I guess, for effectively using the RICO Act when he did. I will say a couple of things about him. I thought he was a great mayor in New York. He did a lot for the city. He really did clean it up, and I got to give him credit for that. And, it's funny because we recently were interviewed on a radio show here. He did it first. I did it second. And the radio host brought my name up to him, and he actually was pretty complimentary about it. So, maybe he's had a change of heart. But I always tease him. I say, hey, Rudy, I was the only one that beat you. He had me on a big racketeering case, and I was acquitted after a several-month trial. We were the only case that then ended up in acquittals. He convicted everybody else. So at least I got that on him, But look, he's you got to give him credit. I mean, he was a good prosecutor, and he was a good mayor. And actually, politically, we kind of find ourselves on the same side right now. So,
isn't that interesting? Those 50 guys that were published on that Forbes magazine. Knowing that you're basically the only one that's free, and the rest are dead or in prison or somewhat that. Is the ultimate message for people that are listening is that crime doesn't pay, no matter what happens in the short term, or what can we learn from that stat?
Brian, I preach this message to, I do a lot of prison, visits, and I work with a lot of juveniles, gangbangers, and I tell them straight out, you don't get away with criminal conduct in America anymore. Law enforcement is too sophisticated. They got too many weapons. There's too many informants on the street. And if you stay in criminal conduct, you're going down. I mean, that's it. Bottom line, you just don't get away with it anymore. And, for people to get involved in that life on a consistent basis, they're out of their mind. They're going to lose. There's no doubt about it.
I think there was this study that was done, and they took like a project in Chicago's South Side, and they ran the numbers for like the drug dealers and the kind of the juniors, and they ran on how much money did they actually make over the course of like 5 years. Putting in time that you're missing in prison, some of that time that, the big bosses are making more of the money. And they found that, the younger guys were actually making less than minimum wage. And yet they were sold this dream of this big time, cash flow. But the truth is, between the danger of death and prison and all the hierarchy, it wasn't a great decision to make to join that life.
No, not at all. What I tell people all the time, there's a myth out there, and I think the media created that, in that, all mob guys, all gang guys, they're rolling in dough, they're making a lot of money. But I always say this, in our family, the Colombo family, one of the 5 New York mob families. We had 115 made guys that actually took the oath. Out of 115 of us, maybe 20 or 25 were earning good money. The rest was, who's got a no-show job, who's got a gambling problem, pushing little numbers, trying to, extort somebody. They weren't making a lot of money. And all of them end up in jail at some point in time. They all get indicted. They all do jail time. While they're in there, they're not earning a penny. Their families are broke. And that's consistent all the way down the line. One of the things, Brian, when I speak to these young kids, they'll say, oh, I saw Goodfellas and I saw this movie and, you had the women and you had the cars and you had the money. But I say to them, but did you see the end of the movie? Did you watch it all the way through? Who lost everything? Who went to jail? Who got killed? They don't see that part. They only see the good part and they kind of ignore the rest. But, it's a dead end street. And I've been preaching that for the last 20 some odd years. And, I know it for a fact. What else got me, Brian? When things really started to crumble in the 80s, I was shocked at some of the guys that we found out that were informants for years. We didn't know this. I mean, our own people that were informants for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And, you just don't know, man. The street is a tough environment to trust somebody in.
Yeah, that whole myth of loyalty, you soon find out, kind of goes down the drain when people are looking out for themselves. And I know you've got some stories of that I'd love to get into. Tell me about your racket, because it was quite interesting. It was quite advanced. It was quite intelligent. And it separated you from just maybe the common shakedown guy that was doing the other things. You really found some innovation there when it came to your, I think it was a gasoline tax angle. I mean, $10 million a week is a lot of money at your peak. Can you tell us a little bit about how you found it and how you kept it going for so long?
Well, yeah, there is another myth out there. I think that people think that mob guys, get in our social clubs and we invent all of these different ways to make money and what, company we're going to extort or whatever. A lot of times it doesn't happen like that. A lot of times guys come to us with a deal. Maybe they want to defraud their company. They're in a good position. They come to us because they figure we can, provide protection. We can give them money if they need it. And in the gas business, that's what happened. There was a guy out in Long Island, and he had a small gas operation. He had a couple of gas stations, and some other guys from another family were shaking him down. They were trying to extort him. So he came to me for help. And basically, he told me, look, I have a germ of an idea where we can defraud the government out of tax on every gallon of gasoline. So he kind of got my attention. I don't like the government at that point in time. I got rid of the guys for him that were shaking him down. And we went into business together. I'll tell you how it happened. I put a guy with him, a guy by the name of Vinny. He was a butcher. Well, one of my guys, big guy, big scar across the top of his head. And I said, Vinny, watch this guy, Larry. Let's see if he's really got something. So Vinny used to bring me meat every Saturday. He would come because he was a butcher. So this one Saturday, about 2 weeks into this deal, he comes to my house and he's got a box on his shoulder. And it's a Saturday morning. He comes in and I said, what are we doing with all this meat? Are we having a party or something I don't know about? He said, hey, Chief, it ain't meat. He's come in the kitchen. We go in the kitchen. He puts the box down. He opens it up. He said, this is the first week or 2 weeks take in the gas business was $320,000. It all smelled like gasoline, right? They got my attention. To make a long story short, he and I got together and devised a scheme, and it was complicated. We had 18 companies at one point in time. I had over 350 gas stations, and we were servicing just about every branded and unbranded station that we can get a hold of. And we grew that 320 into 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 million a week, depending upon, the volume. And that wasn't all going into my pocket, obviously. That's what we were generating. But, and I was giving up to the family. We had, a lot of people that we were providing cash for, and I did very well myself, but it was a very complicated scheme to keep it going. What I did, Brian, I brought the Russian mob guys from Brighton Beach, Brooklyn in with me. They had a small operation, but they didn't know how to get around the accounting to defraud the government out of tax. And I wasn't going to teach them. I said, you come on board with us and, you'll share in the profits. So, we ran together for about almost 8 years until I went to prison, and the government just couldn't figure it out. We were always one step ahead of them.
So you brought in the Russians because they were experienced when it came to accounting and hiding money?
No, they didn't know how to do the accounting, and they couldn't get the licenses that you needed to collect the tax. You had to be a wholesaler licensed to collect the tax, and then you were, you had to pay the government on a quarterly basis. They couldn't get licensed, and they didn't understand the accounting procedure, how to keep the government at bay for 10, 12 months. And we were able to do that before they came down on us. So we brought them into our operation because they had a few gas stations, and everybody was trying to do what we were doing, and some others did it, but they didn't do it as good as we did. I mean, we were the guys that really, led the way in that.
It's strange that you might work with the Russian mafia, because you never see that in a movie. You just see mafias fighting against each other. What's the upside and downside of dealing with the Brighton Beach guys? And did you have to sell that into your own family?
No, they were great partners, Brian. They were one of the best partners I ever had. I mean, no, there was three of them really, and they weren't afraid of the justice system here. One of them had did time in a Russian prison. He said, "Michael, this would be a walk in the park if I ever got in trouble here." And they were very intelligent, and they were very committed. And we got along great, for like I said, almost 7, 8 years. So, we don't care who we get involved with as long as they're doing the right business with us. We got involved. There was a group in New York of Irish mob guys called the Westies. We did business with them. They were another good group. Stayed away from the street gangs. We didn't get involved with, Bloods and Crips and all that kind of stuff. But, anybody that worked effectively with us, we weren't racist or prejudiced in that regard. You worked well with us, we'll do business with you.
I mean, when there's that much cash coming out of a business like that, what's to stop someone like that from trying to grab an extra $500,000 a week? How do they avoid the temptation, and how do you keep an eye on that?
Well, they really don't. The deal I cut with the Russians was funny. I said to them, when we cut a deal, I said, look, here's how it's going to go. 75% me, 25% you. And they kind of huddled together, and they came back and they said, Mr. Mike, we don't see that as fair. I said, no, it's very fair. I'm going to tell you why. He said, why? I said, because you guys are on the street. You're going to steal from me. I know that. That's the game. I said, but I won't be that angry with you because I'm getting the lion's share. I said, but just don't let me catch you, I told them. And they laughed. And, look, guys on the street are always going to play a few games. But, when you're making that much money, Brian, what does it really mean? You don't want to police the effort that much. You want to have a good relationship. And if they're taking a few extra bucks, what's a big deal? That's how I looked at it anyway.
Yeah, that's smart. So you ask for your 75. If you get 70 or 68%, you're still happy. They're happy. And they know they got to keep it moving forward. And I guess as long as everyone's bringing something to the table year after year after year, the partnership continues.
Absolutely. And they held up their end. These guys were great. I always say it. They were some of the best partners that I ever had.
And I'm thinking, when you're stealing that much money, the only way you can do that over a long period of time is if it's from the government, right? Because anyone else, it seems to me, is going to notice. But if it's the federal government, I mean, is that the one entity where you actually could have got away with this?
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, I'll be honest with you. My targets on the street were always, I went after insurance companies. I went after banks, obviously the federal government. I mean, I kind of set my standard pretty high. And, they were all pretty easy to defraud. I'm going to be honest with you. And look, I always reasoned it this way. You get as much time for $500,000 as you do for $10 million. So you may as well go for the big time. And, as long as you present yourself the right way and you understand the dynamics involved, it's not that difficult. And the government, they were so archaic in their collection practices that they just couldn't keep up with us. We were always a step ahead of them. And quite honestly, I don't know if they even care about the money. I mean, they have to, work to get it, but do they really care? I mean, I don't know. I'll be honest with you. I don't know, Brian. It was a funny experience for me.
It's a good question. I mean, it's some civil servant who's making some medium salary, checking on the tax receipts of gasoline. If 50 or 100 million are missing, does he care at the end of the day? I guess that's the question, right?
Well, let me tell you the difference between the federal and the state governments, the way they operated. I got indicted for a racketeering case on gas in Florida because I had a big operation there. Florida, they wanted the money. I could have walked away with practically no time. They said, we defrauded $80 million. Let's make a deal. Give us some money back. And they weren't looking for the jail time. The feds, just the opposite. They'd rather have you in jail than collect the money that's due to them. So, what does that tell you?
Yeah, I guess they don't care as much about the money. And then not only when you started making this money, you started diversifying your operations and you started going into gambling and a bunch of other things. Was that just a natural outcrop for you to get involved with all those things? And is there anything you wish you would have done differently?
Well, when you're on the street, bookmakers, collecting illegal bets, they don't operate without being part of our network. We won't let them operate. And, they need us anyway, because, bookmakers give credit. Somebody don't want to pay. They come to us to do the collection. Sometimes they need money. We forward them money, advance them money. So bookmakers were always connected with us. And I had a number of them working with me, under me at that point in time. I wasn't a bookmaker myself, but I had them answering to me. And then, I diversified, and I always had money on the street, Shylock money. That's part of your thing. Most of the time you give it to a business that you feel could pay, or if they can't pay, you're going to become their partner. I had a lot of my own guys that I would give money to so that they can give it out and make a couple of points a week for themselves. So you're always into that. Never had anything to do with drugs, Brian. We were not allowed in our family to get involved in drugs. And for me personally, I hated anything to do with drugs because I had, serious consequences in my own family with it. But, and then I had a lot of legitimate businesses going. I had 2 car dealerships. I had a number of restaurants that I had opened at the time. I had a leasing company. I had a production company in Southern California, in Hollywood. So I had a lot of things going. So I used some of that money to have a legitimate operation and income.
Let's talk about the drugs really quick, because I remember that from the movie The Godfather. And again, maybe you can tell me if that movie stands up or if it actually is based in reality. But, there's the point where they have the big meeting, I think, after, Sonny's killed. And they kind of make up, and he just said, no drugs, I don't want you dealing in the drugs. It's bad for business, et cetera, et cetera. Was that really true? Or did people still do it on the side? And then a bigger question than that is, if the mob was still around and if they were running the drug business of today, would it be a different business? Would there be less violence? Would it be, a different kettle of fish?
Well, let me say this, during my era, I was told the night I got made, Halloween night, 1975, you deal in drugs, you die. That's it. We don't deal with drugs in this family. Carlo Gambino, no drugs. Paul Castellano, no drugs. Now, were guys doing it on the side? Yeah, small time. Not even, they couldn't compete in any way with the guys in Mexico or Colombia or anything like that. Not at all. But yeah, guys were doing it on the side. And there was some guys in our life prior to that era that were dealing pretty heavily in drugs. But it was hands off during my time. And look, I had a very dear friend of mine. He was a made guy. I knew him my whole life. He got caught in a small drug deal and was afraid he was going to get walked into a room, and he killed himself. He was that scared. So, sometimes I get criticized when I say we weren't allowed to be involved in drugs, because people online, I'll say, oh, Michael, come on. In my era, drugs were hands off. Some guys were doing it, but they weren't supposed to be doing it. Would we have done it more effectively? I don't know. Look, Brian, there's a fallacy out there that, our first way to rectify something was through violence. That's not true. In our family in Cosa Nostra, murder was very serious. It wasn't something that we did randomly. It had to be approved by the boss. If it was another guy in our family, a made guy, he wasn't there for himself, but basically there was almost a trial held, where people are for it and against it. And then the boss made a decision, and that was the decision, like it or not. So it wasn't something that we were out there randomly killing people. It didn't happen that way. Again, and I say through my experience, my 25 years in the life. Now, obviously, violence is a part of that life, and I'm not gonna say that's not true. Of course, it happens, and it happens often, but it's taken very seriously. So, drugs, because it got the attention of the police, because there is a lot of violence in drug dealing, because there are other groups involved, I think those are the major reasons why we wanted to stay out of it for the most part.
There's that famous line in the movie where, I think Don Corleone says, or maybe it's him, where he says, or maybe it's another of the other bosses says, the rackets and the prostitution. He said that's something that the politicians can let slide, but if it's the drugs, it's something they won't let slide. Is there something about that market that goes against kind of the fabric of the family or the fabric of the Cosa Nostra, where it really is like oil and water? It just doesn't really mix for the long term, the way that was set up?
Yeah, and I had discussion because that affects, people's lives individually. It's not like you're taking money off of them. You're putting something in their bodies that's potentially it could kill them. And look, we did have regard for families and kids. I mean, look, I had a sister who died of an overdose of drugs. My brother was a drug addict for 25 years. I mean, I hate anything to do with drugs because I saw we were personally affected by it. So a lot of guys had a conscience with that, and there's other ways to make money. A lot of these other mob gangs and stuff out there, if you take drugs away from them, they collapse. That's it. They're drug empires. Take the drugs away, they collapse. We weren't in that position. I mean, we control the unions. We had politicians, that we controlled. You control the unions in America, you control the country to a great degree, because politicians rely on you. You call we have the Teamsters. You call a Teamster strike, you stop 2.5 million people from working. Trucks stop. You call a strike at the docks. What happens? Nothing comes in and out of the country. I mean, this is powerful stuff. So we had other ways to make money. We were very diverse in that way. We didn't rely on drugs, where these other groups, many of them do.
Yeah, and people kind of don't remember those days of the Hoffa days and where you guys could shut things down, even with, the concrete in New York City. You could just, your building's not going to be built for 2 weeks, and that can bankrupt a builder, right? So you really had your finger on a different kind of pulse, and I guess you stuck to your knitting in that sense.
Oh, absolutely. I controlled a couple of locals that we had a lot of money in our pension fund. You take that, you talk about defrauding a bank. You go to the bank, any bank, and you say, look, I got $500,000 here, or I got, 750,000. I'm going to put it in your bank. Okay. But I want a loan. I don't want you to tie that money up, but I want a loan for $100,000. They're not going to say no, because you're putting, a substantial amount of money that's going to stay on account. Plus it's going to build. I mean, that's powerful when you can do things like that. So, and we had that ability, and politicians, we tell a politician, hey, we'll make sure that local 129 and their families, you got their vote, but here's what we want in return. So, I mean, we had that kind of juice and that kind of power where, other groups just don't have that. They rely on the drug business. You take it away and they collapse.
Yeah, I think a lot of the gangs these days are trying to diversify into cybercrime now, I think is the thing where, they're trying to maybe get away from that. Is that true?
Oh yeah. I mean, even I hear some rumblings in the street in my former life, that there's big money in that and guys are going for it. And, hey, let me tell you one thing about, mob guys, they're pretty resourceful. I'm asked all the time, is the mob still in existence? The answer is yes. It's not the same as it was during my time, but I wouldn't count these guys out. They're not going away in my lifetime. That's for sure.
I mean, I think about the racket you used to run with the gas tax. I mean, imagine Franzese with an internet connection. That could have gotten a little crazy.
I thought about that quite a bit. It would have been, well, let me not get into that, Brian.
Okay.
Not give anybody any ideas.
Because then you don't have to be local necessarily. You could be global, and and there's a lot of money out there, trillions of dollars potentially in that business. So, let me ask you a question: If when you look at the drug cartels now, and the MS-13s and the gangs, and how it's moved from Colombia into Mexico, and the Sinaloa cartels, and how sometimes the violence spills over the border. Like, if I was in the Sinaloa cartel and I called you up and you were going to give me an hour of your time and no one was ever going to listen, would you advise these guys that, look, if drugs are going to be illegal for the next 100 years, is there a better way to do business? Because it seems to me that violence and chaos, it's never in the interest of people doing illegal activity. I don't know. What do you think when you see those things happening?
Well, look, you might get away with that to a degree, in South America or in Mexico, but you're not going to get away with that here in America, not for any length of time. Again, law enforcement is too sophisticated and too many weapons. So if you were going to try to establish that kind of a cartel here in the United States, it wouldn't work. So I would advise them strongly against that. You just couldn't do it, but you can in other countries, but not here. So look, I always advise everybody, you got to go legit today. There's no other way here in this country to go. There's, again, too sophisticated, too many weapons, too many informants. Brian, I'll give you a little story that happened to me. When I was in custody, I'd taken a plea on my federal racketeering case, and the underlying act was fraud. And I was in custody, and they had to bring me to Florida because I had to take a plea there because I wrapped them both up together, right? They were going together. And on the plane ride back, I had about 15 agents surrounding me, and they were transporting me back to the jail. And we were talking, and they were saying, okay, Mike, now that it's all over and you took the plea, when we were surveilling you here, did this really happen? They were going like that, and I told one agent, I said, you know what? I took a plea because I got tired of beating you guys. I beat you 5 times. I figured I'd give you one win. I probably would have beat this case also. And one guy looked at me, I'll never forget. It was an FBI agent, and he said, Michael, not this time. He said, you became a star, and they were lining up to testify against you. And you know what? He was right. People that I thought that were close to me, they just didn't want to do the time. And the government offers you a great deal. Put you in witness protection, reduce your jail sentence. Don't worry about it. We'll change your identity, give you some money, and you'll live happily ever after. Why go to jail? That's pretty hard to turn down.
So that's always the weak link, basically, is informants and people on your team. And they'll always talk to a certain extent, right?
Yeah, look, they approached me heavily. They wanted me to do a lot of things. And, I wasn't interested in hurting people, Brian. I wasn't mad at anybody when I walked away from the life. I just saw that it was over. I said, this is a problem. And that guy put it in my head, if I stay on the street, I'm going to end up in jail for the rest of my life. So what am I doing? But I wasn't mad at anybody. I didn't want to put anybody in trouble, but they came on me really, really heavy. There's no doubt. And look, I spoke to them about certain things, not about anybody in particular, didn't send anybody to prison, but you're trying to, okay, leave me alone. I'm out. I'm really out. You try to convince them of that. But man, other guys went, full force, and they went in and, put a lot of guys in prison and made deals, and guys that I was shocked. I never thought would go that route.
Right. Just to finish up on the drugs thing, if we stuck your name on the ballot and you got elected as president, what would you do about the war on drugs? Like, what would you actually do there? Is it solvable, or will it be a vice that's always going to have to be illegal, which means there'll always be illegal characters and violence and et cetera? Or what can be done, in your opinion?
It's very hard. I don't have the automatic cure. I wouldn't legalize it. I would not. I don't think that's legalizing it and taxing it. I don't think that's the answer. It's all about enforcement, protecting our borders, very, very important. But, now a major problem with drugs is pharmaceuticals. People can get this stuff over the counter. That's the real thing. That's a real problem, real problem. And I don't know how, is it regulation? Is it some kind of enforcement? I never got into it to study it, but I would certainly make it a priority if I were in that position, because drugs are killing us here in this country. They really are. This younger generation that we have, it's such a problem. You go in the prison, 80% of the people in prison are there for drugs. In all the prisons across the country. That's just the way it is. So we have to somehow get a hold of it. And I can't tell you I have the answer at this moment, but it would be a priority for me.
But not legalizing, even though we saw what happened with Prohibition, and we saw what happened with Capone in Chicago, and we saw how that experiment didn't work. It actually promoted more illegal activity and more gang activity. But still, you don't think that would be the solution?
Heck no. Come on. You can't really compare alcohol to hard drugs. Listen, I love a glass of wine. I shouldn't be prohibited. I don't think they're in the same category. I know people try to make that comparison all the time. Well, alcohol is just as bad. Look, what's the word? You can't litigate everything that could potentially be harmful to you. I mean, you got to use your head. You got to be an adult. You're going to drink and drive. Well, that's a problem, and there should be an enforcement for drunk drivers. Obviously there is, but you can't litigate everything that's possibly harmful to you. You have to, you got to use your head too.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Tell me about you, because you could have easily missed this life. You were going to go pre-med, I think. You were a smart kid. You're obviously a very smart guy. You could have probably done anything. And yet you decided to go down this route. Why? Why did that happen to you, Michael?
Well, I never aspired to be a mob guy. That wasn't what I wanted. I mean, I always say, I was going to be a doctor. I mean, I had a real interest in that. I was an athlete. But I grew up with my father, who was a very high profile guy in the 60s. And I love my dad very much. And he went through several trials in the 60s until finally he got convicted on a major federal case and sentenced to 50 years in prison. And, I needed to help him out because he said to me, Mike, I'm framed. They said that he ordered a series of bank robberies throughout the country. He said, Mike, I'm not a bank robber. It's not true. The government framed me. And I believed him. And he saw my involvement in his life as a way to help him out. So he proposed me for membership. It's not something that I would have done anything you wanted me to do. It's okay, Dad, you want me to become a member? I'll become a member. It's not like, oh, I wanted it. This is what he wanted for me. But once I got in, I said, hey, I'm going to be the best possible mob guy I could be. And I tried to use the life as best I could to benefit me in business. And that's how I looked at it. So, I could have won a different route, but, Brian, it's tough to look back. I mean, I have certain regrets for things that I did as a member of that life. But if people said, if you had it to do all over again, would you have changed it? Look, my life has turned out okay now. I mean, I'm very fortunate, very blessed. So I don't know. I mean, I try not to look back in that way.
And who was your dad in the Mafia? Like, what was his rank and how did he kind of come up, and what did you learn from him? And I guess he did it in a different time where the rules were slightly different.
Yeah, I mean, my dad was, he was the John Gotti of his day. Very, very high profile. He was a captain in a Colombo family. He had worked his way up to Underboss. He was Joe Colombo's Underboss for a time. And, I learned a lot from my dad. He was, a master at this life. He was known as an enforcer. My dad was a pretty tough guy, but he was also, he was very charismatic. He was a good presence in that life. And he taught me a lot. And that was very valuable to me, as I navigated that life. And, he did 40 years in prison on that 50. We could never overturn his conviction. He was released in 2017 at the age of 100. And he died earlier this year at the age of 103. He was the oldest living mob guy in America, quite possibly in the world. I don't think any other guy lasted that long. Wow. So, I mean, he had quite a legacy.
Wow. What did you learn from your dad?
I learned so many things. I mean, as far as navigating that life, my dad taught me, always be, don't ever be quick to judge somebody. Don't ever be quick to, condemn somebody. He told me how to be a good listener. He taught me, he said to me, Michael, and this was very valuable in that life. He said, if you and I committed a crime, we did it together. He said, 1 minute after we commit the crime, if you talk to me about it, I'm going to say, I don't know what you're talking about. He said, there's no reason to ever repeat anything that you did the wrong way. He said, look at every telephone as a cop. Don't speak on the phone. Be careful. So he taught me so many things that they seem like little things, but they were major in that life. He also told me, he said, Mike, when you go to prison, he said, I want you to remember 3 things that'll help you out tremendously. I said, what's that, Dad? He said, remember to say, please, thank you, and excuse me. He said, those 3 things, he says, because everybody in prison, so many guys in prison rather, he said, the respect they never got on the street, they wanted in prison. You bump into somebody, oh, excuse me. You want to step in front of somebody on a line, excuse me. You ask for something, say please. He gives you something, say thank you. He said, those 3 words are going to help you out more than you know. And he was so correct about that. I never had a problem in prison, ever, not one time, because I was courteous to people. So things like that in the street are very valuable. And I took those things with me, in my life today. I try to give people respect. It doesn't matter who they are. Another thing my dad taught me, Brian, he said, always be respectful to the little guy. Now, he didn't mean the little guy to be offensive. He just meant, give respect to the little guy, the waiter, take good care of him, the guy at a valet park, or take care of him. Always be.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.